Yo, what's up guys? Sensus here, and welcome to the first video on the new channel. Today we're going to be doing a Rogue vs Monk dueling guide. I'm going to be going over the duels that I had with Zwan a few weeks ago. I'm going to be talking about the specs that I used for both combat and subtlety, and I'm also going to go over some things that I learned while dueling Zwan, so let's just go ahead and get right into it. Alright, starting off with subtlety spec, I ran with Subterfuge, Combat Readiness, Elusiveness, Burst of Speed, Internal Bleeding, Mark for Death, and Venom Rush. Now some of you might be wondering why I ran with Internal Bleeding over Prey on the Weak, and that's because monks essentially have two outs to your stuns. They have their Trinket and they have Nimble Brew, so it's kind of difficult to get the most out of your stuns while dueling a monk, so that's why I ran with Internal Bleeding. Moving on to Glyphs, as subtlety spec I ran with the Glyph of Cheap Shot, the Glyph of Energy, and the Glyph of Blind. Alright, next up for combat spec, I ran with Subterfuge, Combat Readiness, Elusiveness, Burst of Speed, Internal Bleeding, Mark for Death, and Venom Rush. And for glyphs, I ran with the Glyph of Faint, the Glyph of Blind, and the Glyph of Recuperate. And essentially I was going for more of a tanky build because monks can put out a lot of consistent damage. So really when you duel a monk as combat, you're trying to play defensive until you force Karma and you get red buff. And with that, let's move on to the actual duels. Okay, starting off with the subtlety duel. One thing to note about subtlety versus monks essentially counter subtlety spec. So really the only way you're going to win versus a monk in an open world environment as subtlety spec is if your opponent makes a lot of mistakes. If you make any mistake, you're essentially going to lose. So that's one thing to keep in mind when dueling a monk as sub spec. Sub actually kind of sucks overall for duels. Personally, I really only duel as subtlety spec when I verse, say, a warrior or another rogue, because it's just not good for putting out consistent pressure. So that's just one thing to keep in mind about sub spec. So anyway, I start off by using pre-med into Slice and Dice, and I open up with Cheap Shot into Rupture. And I pop Shadow Dance and Trinket, and he makes kind of a big mistake right here, and he doesn't Trinket or Nimble Brew the opener. So after I opened and realized he wasn't going to Nimble or Trinket it, I used kind of a lockdown stun rotation, which pretty much includes me doing a Cheap Shot into a Kidney Shot into another Cheap Shot. So essentially the entire rotation goes Cheap Shot into Rupture, pop Shadow Dance, Ambush, Ambush, Kidney Shot, Mark for Death, Eviscerate, Ambush, Cheap Shot, Eviscerate. And that should bring him down to around 20% in the opener alone. But the sad part about subspec, that's pretty much where the majority of your pressure ends until Shadow Dance comes back up. So until that happens, you want to try to remain offensive and somewhat defensive at the same time. And also, as soon as he karmas you, you want to try to blind that instantly and get a clean re-stealth. This will allow you to either wait for stun DRs or just wait for Shadow Dance to come back up and get a nice hard re-opener. And you also want to use your defensive CDs wisely. As you saw earlier in the duel, I was able to use Evasion on his leg sweep. And I was also able to use Combat Readiness when he used Hurricane Strike, and I also kept Feint up at the same time. And you never want to underestimate Feint. Feint could be your best friend when it comes to avoiding huge damage situations. So definitely use Feint if you think that a big burst is coming. But try not to overuse it because you're just going to end up energy starving yourself. So right here I was able to wait long enough for Shadow Dance to come back up, and I was able to get another one of those lockdown openers going, which allowed me to put out some good pressure. And since I used Evasion on his leg sweep earlier, I was able to Trinket it this time, which pretty much allowed me to win the duel. Now I'm just going to let the duel play out without any sort of commentary. Now moving on to the combat duels, combat spec could actually work the exact opposite as subtlety when it comes to dueling monks, in the sense that it could actually counter them if played correctly. So in these duels, I typically opened up with Cheap Shot into Adrenaline Rush, into Revealing Strike, and then I just spammed Sinister Strike until 5 comp points and followed my cheap shot up with a kidney shot. And this allowed me to get out some really good early pressure and also build up my buff really early on in the duels. And one thing I also did, which kind of made me a tank in the opener, is I popped Combat Readiness and Feint at the same time right before kidney shot faded. And in doing this alone, it allowed me to stay pretty far ahead in every duel that one enemy had. One key thing that combat has that subtlety lacks is good consistent pressure even outside of bursts. And also one thing you want to keep in mind about combat spec, you really only want to killing spree on a red buff, and you only want to use killing spree after you force karma. Because if your opponent still has karma and you use killing spree, he could just karma you and there goes all that damage into you, so you definitely don't want that to happen. Now I did make a mistake this duel and I didn't blind him on karma, which allowed him to just heal himself up. That's just something that you guys could take away from this video. You always want to blind him on karma so he doesn't have the chance to do that. And also just be sure to keep up recuperate and slice and dice, and use feint whenever you see hurricane strike. The spec is essentially designed to be able to put out consistent pressure while being able to survive long enough to force karma and get a nice red buff killing spree on your opponent. And as long as you play it smart and keep recuperate and slice and dice up as much as possible, then you should win every duel versus monks as combat spec. Anyway guys, that pretty much does it for this video. But before I sign off, I want to give a big thanks to everybody that subbed to the new channel. Hopefully within the coming weeks we can get more and more people to rejoin us on this channel. Now I better stop before I start rambling. I'm just going to go ahead and let the combat duel play out. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And of course, as always, thanks for watching guys. I'll see you next time.